Welcome everybody to today's webinar. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Steve Maul and I lead the global customer success team here at Welocalize. It's great to see everybody joining, the numbers continuing to rise. Lots of names that I recognize and some that I don't, but you're all very, very welcome. Existing clients and global companies that we don't currently work with at Welocalize. It's great to see everybody joining. For anyone that's new to Welocalize, or would like some more background, we are a trusted global language services provider. We work with global businesses in a variety of different industries to reach, to engage, and to grow international audiences by delivering innovative solutions and a range of language services. Anyone that does know Welocalize knows, I think, how much we enjoy and encourage the knowledge sharing, the information exchange, the networking that happens at all our events. And the goal today is to continue this and to provide some content that gives global companies some takeaways, some actionable strategies, and the chance to take part and to ask questions of your industry peers. So the theme of today's webinar is using data to show localization ROI. And we're hopefully going to touch on topics like identifying what is the key data for localization managers, how to gather that data, how to gather data that provides value, and then working with others, how to work with other teams, other stakeholders, and the role that data plays in that to help you make better brand decisions and better localization decisions. So we're going to get started very shortly. Very soon you'll meet our guests. Some quick housekeeping. First of all, we're scheduled for 45 minutes. We are able to stay longer if the conversation goes on longer. We are recording this session and we're planning to share that recording with you all later on this week. And you'll notice a questions panel, a Q&A panel. Please do share your questions for us all on the Q&A tab. I'll be monitoring this throughout the conversation. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce you to three fantastic professionals from our industry. So can I ask you to introduce yourself, please, starting with Emma?
Hi, my name is Emma Keane. I am based in Dublin, Ireland, and I'm localization manager with Balsam Brands. My background is in languages, and I've been working in the localization industry for close to 20 years. So yeah, I'm both on client and vendor side, software, localization, documentation, everything online, as well as working with consumer electronics companies as well. So that's it.
Thanks very much. And Patricia?
Hi, I'm Patricia. I'm head of localization at Preply. I've been in the industry for over 10 years now. Started as well on the vendor side as a project manager and linguist, and eventually moved over to the client side. I joined Preply last July after more than 7 years in the gaming industry. Preply is a global language learning marketplace, and it's an edtech startup. It has about 200 employees. Headquarters are based in Kiev, and there's an office in Barcelona. That's it.
Trish, thanks. And finally, Rusha.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rucha, and I am localization researcher and consultant with Nimdzi Insights. Well, I too started with the service side of the industry with Lionbridge and have been in the industry for 15 years. And now I'm a full-time consultant and localization researcher with Nimdzi Insights.
Thanks, Rucha. And I think you're going to kick off the conversation with some interesting data points from Nimdzi.
Definitely. Thank you. So to begin with, a little introduction about us. At Nimdzi Insights, we are a localization industry intelligence, research, and consultancy group. We help our clients successfully navigate international expansion through stakeholder education and global readiness. About localization ROI, we have all had this conversation repeatedly. The question is measuring ROI enough to establish role of localization in the business? Maybe not. Instead, what needs to be identified and measured is the value of localization that it brings to the business rather than the effort. And when we aim to establish this value addition, we are making a case for a more inclusive content and a more inclusive product. And it all adds up to customer experience. And that is the true impact of localization that needs to get measured as an ongoing process. Let's look at this process. we know that what cannot be measured cannot be managed. Hence, we need to be able to measure ROI and localization impact to be able to manage both. To this, there are many factors to consider. It has to start with identifying your overall business goals, defining the critical success factors, and then tracking the KPIs that measure whether you are successful or not. And a good, first of all, KPI ecosystem, secondly, relevant market search, and the third, demographic data of your target locale. Together, these three contribute to a robust product and content and marketing strategy, of which localization is an essential part. Looking at these three elements separately, can we move to the next slide? Thank you. First of all, the KPIs. Key performance indicators are necessary to manage the predictability. It can help you to close the gap between goals and results, and they help you to identify weak points in your localization strategy and detect new opportunities. So in setting up the KPI ecosystem, the first step is to define 3 to 5 meaningful and relevant KPIs to track as per the business goals. The next is to define measurement, the method to collect and track data, the baseline data for comparison and normalization of that data. Thirdly, then define the rollout and maintenance of this metrics program, the systems and tools to use, sharing of data, collecting stakeholders' input, all of that. And lastly, one needs to maintain good data hygiene, align metrics with the business goals, and share with the stakeholders regularly. The KPIs need to always link back to business goals. And it is vital to collect relevant metrics from other stakeholders too, as each function measures its own performance and it is closely linked with localization program. To show more on KPIs is a use case. Um, on On the topic of how metrics from localization program and other teams can be combined to measure value of localization, I was shared this interesting case by Miguel, our globalization specialist. Miguel was discussing a possible language elimination on one of the video games that they localize into for cost reduction. And he used a combination of localization cost and sentimental analysis feedback instead of using the typical ROI model. He took the outsourcing cost per word per language and the cost of internal and external project management as overheads to derive the total cost of localization. And then he took the cost of creating a video game per year and calculated the percentage of development cost versus the localization cost. It is a tiny figure if you think about it, but we are talking about millions spent on development versus thousands spent on localization. And what was extremely useful was an A-B testing and sentiment analysis, which is another type of metric that we can frame in an ROI scenario, although it often goes unnoticed. Here, the players of the game were segmented in two groups, A and B. Group A were given only the English version, and Group B were given the localized version to download and to use. And it was noticed that Group B were shown, Group B and the metrics of that group were much better in user retention and even much better in sentiment analysis feedback. The reviews from the App Store, of course, were also taken into account. And collecting all those metrics and showing them to the leadership team was crucial to establish that removing languages was possibly not the best choice. This was achieved with the combination of localization cost metrics, gross bookings per market, localized user retention per target market, and sentiment analysis feedback. The whole exercise of proving localization value is a combination of operational and functional metrics collected by various stakeholders, and not just the localization program. Moving on to the other important data systems, the research and demographics. At NIMSI, we conducted a research on online buyer behavior and how language affects the user choice. We call it the project underwear. The research aimed to equip businesses in shaping their globalization strategy. It was across 70 countries, 66 languages, and over 9,000 replies were analyzed. And the research established two things. Firstly, buyer behavior is what informs and defines localization strategy. And localization is the driver of user engagement, where 9 out of 10 respondents saying that they would be more interested in a product if it were made available in their own language. A very relevant another research that NIMSI conducted, um, that is the operational consumption in online consumption index. Um, if you could move to the next slide. Thank you. NIMSI online consumption index was a research, was a kind of a ranking of 217 countries and over 400 languages by percentage of online spending behavior. The index shows that if ROI is what you need to measure, then the question shouldn't be how many people speak this language, but rather how much money can be spent by people who speak this language. So it is not just about the total addressable market, but also about their disposable income, their purchasing power, the purchasing power parity of their currency, and household final consumption expenditure, etc. This indicator is of particular use for the e-commerce industry, and it helps measure the market penetration and provide context for setting up international distribution. So the true impact of localization is more about enhanced customer experience and making a product more inclusive than just adding a language or a locale to a new market. And if we see the data which matters the most is with the end users. So buyer behavior, customer satisfaction, net promoter score, all these can be combined with more traditional indicators of a market's economic weight and other demographics to decide whether or not to localize and to build other strategies around it. Use pre-sales indicators as predictive metrics along with demographic data, research data for estimation of effort and funding needs, and it contributes to content and localization or language strategy and prioritization. And then use post-sale indicators along with process metrics from stakeholders and localization program to measure the value addition and thereby the localization impact or ROI. Moving on to the last slide. Um, I would like to fill a few gaps in our understanding of what and how to collect and some best practices around that. It is easy to fall in the data trap. The more we collect, the better we can measure. It's not entirely true. Not everything that can be counted really counts. Based on the vertical that you're in, collect operational data and metrics relevant to stakeholders and the overall business. The success of the localization program is not about localization itself. It is about the other stakeholders achieving their goals and it all adding up to the organizational goals. During the setting up of KPI ecosystem, it is important to set a baseline always for comparison for the metrics. So it aids in comparison later on and while measuring the localization impact. And a baseline is also helpful in normalizing the data collected and maintaining its hygiene. Don't forget the system and methodology in the wake of metrics. So bring in the experts to mine the right data and help you analyze it correctly. Bring in a data scientist, bring in a data analyst, a consultant and researcher in your industry. And most importantly, we are all governed by market forces, the external forces that are outside our control. And so internal KPIs or metrics should not be used in isolation. Your strategy for multi-market entry and measuring its success needs to factor in those market forces from the demographic data and relevant researches in the industry. And lastly, something that I'd like to add, my boss, Renato Beninato, always says that localization is news only when it is bad. I think it is an important message here to share with the program sponsors, the C-level, and the leadership team that localization not having its own separate formula or ROI figures is because it is so efficiently and seamlessly embedded with other product, content, and marketing functions. And so going unnoticed is probably a better sign of its presence. Steve, with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Richard, thanks very much. Lots of great information there, and if you try to scribble it all down, write it all down, there's no need. It will be shared. The recording will be shared with everybody. And just a quick thank you to everybody who shared a question so far. Please keep them coming in, and we'll get to as many as we can. I have a question. I think for the panelists first of all, though, maybe Emma, let's start with you. What data matters most for you to collect?
Yeah, so I mean, I can only second everything that Rusha was saying. So what data matters most? Well, the first thing that you need to start with is, what do I want to know? What is the information? So you start with your question. In our case, we're an e-commerce company, so it kind of can be summarized as find, love, buy. Can our customers find us? So this is all your SEO. How do you measure your traffic, people who are landing, bounce rate? Love, do they love our content? Are customers engaging with our content? Again, that totally ties back to what Rusha was saying. And then obviously, do they buy? So in our case, it's a hardware product, so it's like, year-on-year growth, compound annual growth. Those are the kind of metrics that we would be looking at. On a slightly more granular level, obviously, we look at a lot of SEO traffic, but a key focus for me, as we are really focusing on our marketing content and on trying to, build the brand in the markets, a key metric for my team is customer engagement and our customers engaging with our content. So if people want examples, it's things like, time on page, year on year, monitoring the data, conversion rate, click-through rate, bounce rates, all those they're very standard e-com metrics, really. But I find them very important to monitor from my perspective. Obviously, I also need to maintain the core localization metrics to manage the operational side. So I need to maintain both sets of metrics. One thing, sort of a key learning, I think, for everyone here is that generally people outside of localization don't want to hear about your localization metrics. I find they kind of glaze over, but yet those metrics are really important for me to be able to move the dial if one of the other metrics of my cross-functional partners isn't, going so well. So yeah, it's kind of two buckets, and it's on the localization lead or manager to help interconnect. You're like an API in some ways. Sure.
Maybe the same question to you, Patricia. What data matters most for you to collect in Preply?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Emma was just saying about asking questions, making sure you understand what it is that the business wants. So for me, what data to gather depends on the overall objective of the company. In my case, for example, the company is mostly set on growth, which means that the metrics we are using within the localization team will also be adapted to that. We will make sure that we focus metrics on conversion as opposed to maybe lifetime value, which I see more as an engagement metric. It's also important to mention that when you're setting up your team objective, your OKR, so to speak, that you make sure that they connect to these overall business objectives. And you can always demonstrate the impact of what it is you're doing with your team to those overall objectives. So if your objective is to grow, and in our case, an example would be that we saw a performance on the English version of the website was a lot better in terms of traffic and conversion than the performance of another few local versions of the website, then we try to fill that gap by taking actions to improve traffic and to improve conversion, which means you have to select the teams that you want to be working with for a certain period of time to focus on those growth metrics. In our case, we chose to work with inbound content, SEO, working on localizing blog articles, and measuring the impact of that, looking what's happening with the traffic, how much of our content is now in English, how much of our content is in other languages, making sure that we have full insights. We can also report on that. I think is very important. As a localization team, you are very data driven and very focused on showing the impact of what you're doing by measuring the right metrics.
Actually, just to follow on to what Patricia was saying there, I think that's a really key point that she just brought up, like the example of her working with the content team. Really, I think the key is that we learn as localizers to work with our cross-functional partners to really understand the metrics that they need to measure and that they need to improve. And then we can help them with our localization expertise to improve them in the other locales. And so, every day is a school day. It's like a constant learning with all of the different cross-functional partners. What is it, how do they measure the success of their content, and what levers can they pull to move the dial? And then it's up to us as localization leads, managers, to be able to take that information and transform it into a way that we can affect the same or similar change in our localized content. The other key thing I'd love to say is that I really don't see a difference between source content and localized content. They should all be held up to the same bar. I know that's holding us localization folks up to quite a high bar, but still, that's what we should be aiming for. Content is content, and the yardsticks should really be the same.
So you find the data you collect is helping you interact with other stakeholders in the business, with other key stakeholders.
Yeah, I think you have to have your data, and you have to have your core localization metrics that you, as the head of localization, can fall back on to understand different feedback that you may be getting from your different partners. And how far do you actually share that information out, or how do you word it? Maybe you need to kind of translate it for the audience to whom you're talking. You need to, as Patricia said, like, talk their language, even though you're really coming at it from the localization perspective. So I can think of a good few examples from our side where this data has influenced business decisions. For example, we're looking at web traffic year on year, and that's another thing. Like, we're kind of lucky. We take a long-term view when we look at data like trends. I think you need to be careful to not get too hooked up on one point in time. It's like the bigger picture is the really important piece there. Yeah, so it's like, which SEO do we need to make more investment in, or what potential new markets could we look at going to? What regions are searching for our product that we don't yet have a web store in, and then you start researching the total addressable market. Again, that research that Rusha was talking about. Yeah.
It might be interesting for the audience, actually, anyone who doesn't know. Could you share with the audience what it is, what kind of decor brand products that Balsam sells?
Yes, we are a home decor company. Our core brand in Europe is Balsam Hill. So we do primarily Christmas trees, Christmas decor, wreaths and garlands. They are amazingly luxurious, very high-end products. They come pre-strung. It's not an ad for Balsam Hill, but our stuff's amazing, so go check us out. So yeah, but basically that's why the project underwear study was so interesting for me, because in our brand, we're looking to try and win over the hearts and minds. We want to be the focal point of families' Christmas celebrations. And so, yeah, they need to feel comfortable. They need to want us in their homes, to pay the price of the product. They want to feel that it's a luxury brand, and they really need to be talked to in the right way. And it's this kind of content, it's kind of the trickiest mark to hit, I think, really, but it's a really interesting challenge.
Absolutely. Patricia, you mentioned the acronym. I think you used the acronym OKR before. That'd be useful to explain in case anybody not familiar with it.
Yeah. It basically means objectives and key results. So this is what we use to set ourselves quarterly goals as a company and also as teams. And the very useful thing of this is that you can use this as a tool to build a good collaboration and partnership with other teams by connecting to each other's OKRs. Like adding to what you said, how data can help you interact better with customers. I think I have another interesting example with that respect. Like the starting point for me at Preply was building this team up from scratch, and there was actually very little data available whatsoever. So there was also very little data available on our operational cost, for example, but also not on quality. And for me, quality is very strongly linked to what customers think of the product. What are their trust levels when they visit the website? It's an online marketplace. So in that sense, if the trust levels are low, it's not good for business. And what we did to connect our own definition of quality to metrics that matter to the business was looking at what does that assumption of good quality actually do with user behavior. So we did a small user research as a localization team, which was quite outside of our comfort zone. It's not usually a core job of localization team to run a user research. But we did first off, a quality audit. And I think, Steve, you remember that because we worked with your agency for the first language we did, which was German. That gave a result. It gave a summary of our findings from a linguistic point of view. But the interesting thing here was to try and collect the feedback directly from our customers, actually from the users of our platform, to see if that resonated. And we had some real interesting findings there in terms of preferences for tone of voice or formal use versus informal use. Once we shared these insights with the business, that kind of triggered a conversation about quality of our languages, so English versus local languages, as opposed to user behavior and therefore conversion, engagement metrics, and actually selling more in the end, which is what everybody in a company is interested in learning more about.
Patricia, can you talk a little bit about exactly how you did that? Because I remember asking you and I found that super interesting. Maybe others listening might be interested as well, like the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, sure. So in our case, we have a dedicated user research team. But as you can imagine, there's lots and lots of different projects for a user research team to focus on within a year. So since they didn't really have capacity, it kind of came naturally. We had our questions that we wanted to close the loop. We wanted to know what our customers thought. In order to do that, we needed to understand how to run a user research. So we basically had a crash course with the user research team on how to create questionnaires, different types of tests. One typical test that we did was a close test, which basically means you have a piece of content, you take out a few elements of that piece of content, and then you ask whoever is filling in that test to add and to fill the gap, so to speak, which is a very meaningful test to run to find out how people perceive the content and what they expect to find there. So from a user behavior perspective, that was super interesting. And we took that knowledge to run the actual user research and then connected that to our own content audit performed by the localization specialists to come to the results, like what we thought were the issues. Were those indeed the issues? In some cases they were, in other cases they weren't. But this gave us also a good opportunity to find out that there isn't such a thing as English versus other languages. It's English versus Russian versus Italian versus French versus Spanish. So there's a lot of preferences and a lot of differences in how a user or customer behaves on the website. And this was the interesting part that we could share that really triggered a discussion that we should move away from the one global message and then just translated it and scale it to let's think a little while longer about how exactly we think it will have most impact.
That's great. That's a great example. Thanks for sharing that. We've got some questions from the audience. Let me go to one of them right now. And Rusha, I think I'm going to direct this one at you because I think it was picked up on one of the bullet points from your presentation. Can you
Sure.
tell me more about what keeping it localization centric means, and why is it a gap and not best practice?
Sure. Thank you for the question. What I meant by keeping it localization centric is not keeping the KPIs or the achieved objectives to achieve specific to the localization program. Because as I mentioned, localization program is not something, a separate function in itself. It is something that touches the product, that touches the content, that touches the marketing and all functions, and it supports them. It's embedded with them. So looking at just as Patricia just mentioned, it's not about quality as in source versus target. It's about how to enhance the customer experience, and that's where you have all the other functions involved as well. And that is why localization, we cannot be localization centric in the sense program wise. We need to consider other functions also in the business because they are all adding to the organizational goals. And giving a little more example about not just going by the source versus target and localization centric idea, a mindset is there are times when in by way of our research we have found that it's not always accuracy of your translation which is important. At the end of the day, it needs to be relevant and understandable by the end user or the customer. And that is where we move away a little bit from the typical, source versus target. It has to match kind of ideology. And we don't stay in the, let's say, same tunnel as localization. We move outside of that, get more into user engagement, customer engagement, and customer experience. So in that way, we cannot be localization centric. We need to factor in all the other functions and their objectives and organizational goals in the end.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Makes sense. You've got to have a purpose, I suppose. Like, so it's got a great localization score, but so what?
Yeah,
What's the reason that we're localizing in the first instance? So, Emma, what are the gaps? What data would you love to be able to collect in your program?
A lot, actually. So we're kind of new and one person department right now, although we are expanding. So if there's anyone interested, find me on LinkedIn and send me on your CV. But basically, I'm missing a lot of very basic operational data because of the systems that we have been working on to date. Thankfully, that is going to improve. We're moving all of our project management sort of company-wide through to Jira. So I'm really excited about, this time next year. Obviously, Christmas trees, we have a very defined window where there's it's like hyperactivity. It'll be really helpful for me to have concrete data on various different channels of work and throughput. Just for me, when I'm looking at things like how to scale up, which types of resources will we need more of, etc. That is the key. That's like the biggest gap I currently have. The other area I'm going to focus on is to really dive into maybe something like a OKR or KPI, like key performance indicators dashboard that can be like centrally shared on Confluence. That would be sort of more reflective of the business goals and my key cross-functional partner goals, and kind of showing how localization is helping those teams to reach their goals. I presented something similar in our annual kind of season wrap-up last year, and I really could see from the audience that was resonating far more with the business folks than X number of words, but on budget, on time. Like, people really don't care. They don't care about that, but they care about all the other metrics. So I want to create a dash of them. And the thing is, those metrics already exist. It's just a matter of me going and pulling them. And the other key point I'd like to sort of share with all the folks listening, especially if you're in a younger company, is like all of your key stakeholders are most likely very data focused. They will be only too happy to talk to you about their metrics. You don't have to reinvent the wheel actually at all. Just go and talk to your partners and you'll get something really great out of it.
That's good advice. Trisha, how about you?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, again, I agree the full 100% with Emma. Definitely, I had the same experience. People love talking about their own metrics. They love to talk about how they go about analyzing performance on what they do. So definitely a really good tip. I would say there's two examples I can give on where, for us, data is missing. And I won't go into the same operational stuff because I had exactly the same challenges, like no data there. So having to gather everything and structure everything still. But one major insight that I want to offer the company is coverage, actually. How much of our user experience is currently localized? And that may seem simple, but in my case, it's actually not, because we do not have a CMS, content management system. At least not one. So where I get this data on different types of content actually has 4 different sources. And the way it's measured is different in all 4 sources. One of the sources is from our localization tool. So that's a simple translation memory where we can see the content that is live, and then it's quite easy to calculate how much of it is in English and how much of it is translated. That's not the challenge, but the challenge is, for example, getting our SEO content and our metadata mapped out. And I even tried to go on Google Analytics and simply extract all of the pages that we had, which I cannot recommend to anyone because it will take you years to do that. In our case, that was not a good idea, so stop doing that after a few hours. So yeah, there's a lot of dependency on other teams to get what you need, which means you have to make clear to those teams what you need it for. And in my case, I could demonstrate that if we have some kind of report that demonstrates how much of our user experience is currently localized, we also can benchmark it and we can set ourselves targets on where we want to end up. And that's actually interesting for many different sides of the business to have more insights in that. Another example I have on missing data is, again, the actual customer data. We have a couple of assumptions that our traffic is mostly on the English version of the website. And that's leading also to our marketing campaigns and our CRM campaigns to be focused mostly on English. But we started asking, okay, but why is that? Did anybody ever ask why the people visit more the English website instead of the local language ones? And we couldn't find any data on that. And the only way to find that data, to collect it, is just to ask. So there is some data that you can't simply find in metrics, but you have to come up with a plan on how you're going to get the data you need to build further decisions on.
Got you, got you. Another question from the audience, actually, and I think it was you, Emma, who did mention about this, but I'll ask the question to everyone anyway. How big is everyone's localization team, and how many people are dedicated to metrics?
Okay, so just me so far, but I work with like many others. I would say, yeah, I mean, the team is maybe, if I count the core folks that I'm my core localization team, if I'm thinking of SEO, translation, transcreation, quality partners, it's maybe 10 to 15. But basically, I'm managing everything as a one-person show here, and then I get the metrics from my cross-functional partners who all have teams.
Sure. Tricia?
Yeah, for me, it's 7 people now. And I would say everyone is working with metrics. However, due mostly to technical restrictions, I am right now the only one who's actually building reports. But I really made it a point for the whole team to be aware of the metrics, the most important ones, to monitor them and encourage them to learn more about metrics, which is not necessarily something that feels natural to a localization specialist, but I think it's super important to do that.
No, it makes sense. I mean, there's definitely some themes I think coming through everybody's answers and everybody's everyone's suggestions, and I think that's, you know, the need to be data driven, the need to also talk that non-localization language, or talk to non-localization people, you know, using data is coming across loud and clear. So what we might do, just to wrap up the conversation then, is just to ask for a final thought from each of our panelists, maybe starting, Rush, with yourself. Have you got a final thought or a final takeaway for the audience on the topic?
Sure. Just wanted to share, add that there is ample data out there, and it is all complemented by relevant industry researches and demographic data, etc. So I think as a mature industry, we should not be making a case for localization anymore. Instead, make a case for region-specific content, or if you will, hyper-localization. I follow sports clubs and leagues closely, and it amazes me that sports clubs are going a step further, and they are creating region-specific content for fan engagement. And I think the same can be applied to other fast-growing industries like e-learning, of course, games, e-commerce, entertainment, all of that. So yes, definitely, that would be my, food for thought.
Great, great. Emma, how about you? How about a final thought or takeaway for you?
My final thought would be, like, I think you need to focus on talking your partner's language. And I think the key takeaway, like I said a few times, is, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, especially if it's a small team. Maybe you're just one person, but data is really important. And so what you need to do is you need to, find out what your key stakeholders, what they're measuring, and then find ways to, help them improve their metrics. That's, it's a complete team effort, but you can, you got this. Even if you're not a mathsy person, you're a language person like me, that's also totally fine. But you do need to, like, just reach out to your cross-functional partners and work with them, and you'd be amazed at, like, the progress that you can make there.
Right. Yeah, I wrote down on one of your earlier answers, just ask, just reach out and ask. And Patricia, maybe a final thought or takeaway from you as well.
Yeah, and I believe, Steve, you mentioned this earlier as well. Ask yourself the question, so what? Whatever you do, make sure you can answer that question. You can demonstrate the impact of what you're doing. Try to find creative ways to demonstrate that impact. One last example I can give was our localization efforts on the help center for the support team. It's obviously, when you translate help center articles, it's going to add to your localized user experience. But aside from that, how are you going to make sure you're going to get a higher priority for a project like this, which is usually not in the top 3 of what a business feels is most important to do? We were asking ourselves a lot, okay, when we do this, if we do this, what is going to be the benefit of this? And eventually, what you then want to get to is, okay, what is a benefit that really matters to the business? It could be a decrease in workload for the support team, for example. Make sure you can demonstrate that by decrease of number of tickets because you're answering questions in local content that's available for users, or happier users, like increasing your net promoter score, looking at all the metrics that a support team itself would use, and then try to translate those to KPIs for your own localization team in your efforts.
Awesome. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Well, listen, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I hope you've all found this session very, very useful. If you'd like to continue the conversation, or if you've got any further questions, any further suggestions, all our contact details are on the screen now. You can get in contact with us. You can also get in contact with Welocalize at info@welocalize.com. Thanks so much to everybody who also asked a question. If you did ask a question that we didn't answer, then I promise we will get to all of them in the coming days. Let let me think about the so what now for you if you're in the audience. So what, if you did enjoy the webinar, then all our previous webinars are available on welocalize.com. There is a previous one in this current series. That one's called Time to See Localization as an Investment and Not a Cost. And that one was with our friends Lassian at FedEx and Common Sense Advisory. So please go and check that out. And finally, please stay tuned for future webinars that are going to be organized soon. We want to continue the knowledge sharing. We want to continue and keep up the information exchange. And we feel it's so important to our industry, and also the ability to learn from your peers, really. So so with that, I'd like to thank you again, Patricia. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Rusha. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and listening. And we'll see you again next time.